And here we go again. Once more into the fray, my friends. We are live with another segment, part of the OpCon 2002. Good Lord.
2002 from the future.
It's crazy. It's
the
Jeremy.
lines for Hall H are crazy. No, yeah, right there.
Okay. It's Jeremy with me, the Op's very own Mr. Ross Thompson, who has been my co-host for the last day and a half, and there is still much more to come later on tonight. We are amassing a historically deep lineup for Blank Slate at 5 o'clock, and it is a game that you can play where you're sitting right now. This 4 days that we kicked off yesterday is all to celebrate everything pop culture, everything that's happening around Comic-Con, and of course, our friends right here in San Diego, the Op Games. And we've played some fun stuff, Hues and Cues. We've played Geek Out Disney. What else? We went through a whole bunch of Trivial Pursuits last night, and it all kind of ties together with what today's panel is about. We are going deep in conversations about classic games for the modern gamer, and you've got some people that we'll bring in who will all be part of this. Pat, we already know. Pat, say hi.
Hey everybody, good to be back.
Remind people who you are and what you do for the Op.
I apparently have a dog who's upset, so that's a thing happening. But I'm Pat Marino. I'm a game design manager at the Op, so I work with the rest of the team to develop all the rules and gameplay and basically how all the games function before they go off to the art team to make them look pretty.
And then we have a new addition to the stream. Ross, would you like to introduce Tony?
Yes, we're joined by Tony Cerbiani. He is one of the nicest men in the gaming industry in general. I am so thankful I get to work with Tony. He is our inventor relations director, international sales, you name it. Tony has done it.
Inventor relations.
Appreciate that.
That's got to be an interesting tightrope to walk. That's kind of like dealing with influencers, but far more creative and far more out of their minds.
Yeah, I get the good fortune of meeting designers from literally around the world and getting to hear and play their game pitches. It's quite fun.
Interesting. So now, when you say designers around the world, I instantly go, all right, at some point there's a language barrier here. Do you speak 5 different languages, or you just carry around an interpreter wherever you go?
No, I do speak some Spanish, but the beautiful thing about international business is that English has become quite a commonplace language. Fortunate for those of us who have grown up here in the U.S. But the barriers to entry for this industry, because the North American industry is such a large player in the board game space, a lot of designers have wanted to try and break into this market, so a lot of them do speak English. Now, I do see stuff in the rules format that are in other languages, and if that's the case, I then either have to pass on it because we're not going to spend time to do translation of stuff we will eventually pass on or may be interested in, and then oftentimes people will make English specific rule sets of a game that they've designed and developed fully in their own native language, but a PDF of the rules so that those of us who don't speak their native language have an understanding of what it is the game is about.
Now, here's an interesting question that goes along with that. I'm sure you've seen games like that you've had to pass on because of rule sets or because of a language issue. Have you seen a game that looked graphically like something that you wanted to be able to get a hold of, but had to say no because of that barrier?
I wouldn't say that I've had to pass specifically because of a language, because theoretically any game could be translated into any language. There are some designs that I just won't get to see from Japan because traditionally the Japanese game design market is pretty insular when it relates to design and development within their own community. That said, there's a couple of events that take place in Japan a couple times a year, Games Market, where a handful of US and European inventor relations folks travel to these events, and they work with somebody locally as a translator to then get the pitch and to see if there's a game mechanically and experience-wise that might make sense for their lines. And then it's a matter of working with that translator to help negotiate potential contract stuff too.
Tony, thank you for letting me grill you completely offhand of the topics. I just found your job title so very interesting that I wanted to know more about it. Today's panel, we're talking about classic games for a modern gamer. Obviously, you deal with a lot of modern games, but today we're talking about more classic titles like Monopoly, Clue, Risk, things like that, and some of the challenges there may be in crossing those over into what the marketplace is today. I mean, you guys have a lot of IPs, and there's an easy way to get into this is just to dive into the middle of the pool. And for you guys, what was the first IP that you crossed into a classic game and had success with? And was there one that you crossed and found that it didn't connect as well as you wanted it to?
So I only want to go into the first Monopoly that we ever made wasn't really an IP, but it was someplace we all know and love here in San Diego. So our first Monopoly we ever did was the La Jolla edition Monopoly. So it's kind of a fun way to get into that. I always like looking back in the archive and seeing all the different cities and things we've done, which is kind of fun.
So, but along the lines of IP-based games, as Ross mentioned, the La Jolla edition was the La Jolla and San Diego were the first two officially licensed versions of Monopoly that we did. That was back in the mid-90s. And because we started to do what we were doing with cities and states, we began to expand the way in which we were developing games. And because we were doing custom versions, Hasbro would occasionally get approached for an IP to make into a Monopoly game. And so Warner Brothers reached out to Hasbro and Parker Brothers at the time and said, we're launching this new movie called Batman and Robin. We'd love you to make a Monopoly game for it. And they said, we love the idea, but it's too small of an opportunity for us. Go talk to the folks over at USAopoly. So they came and talked to us, and that was, I think, in 97. And this was well before we started doing any licensed versions in this same kind of format that we're doing now. And we dipped our toe into the pool, and it was like an instantaneous business shift because it was working with a singular entity as opposed to a multitude of businesses within a city. And it was going after a group of fans to a particular thing, item, or entertainment property. And it was uncanny the passion for which people had for or against because it touched a heartstring for them. So Batman and Robin was the first real fully officially licensed entertainment one that we worked on. And then another one shortly thereafter with Warner Brothers was The Wizard of Oz.
So that was kind of a paradigm shift for the company at that time. What was your main focus before that?
We were doing cities and states. So the business model at the time was to have there was a group of people that were working to create essentially contracts with local businesses in a city to participate in becoming a property on the square or a property square on the game board. And then there was a big PR launch for the games in those cities, and all the participating companies were donating prizes to these launch events. And it was like a real live property trading game where you were networking with the community, trading property squares, and you were turning those Monopoly sets in for chances for prizes. And it was really an awareness opportunity for the community at large, but also for the physical product. And it was really amazing, but a lot of work. So to shift from doing that into working with a singular entity also was a total paradigm shift, not just on the end product, but the process itself.
I will say, and also having to write the game itself, you go from catering to spots, locations, towns, cities, to now you're really kind of messing with people's fandom, and you better get it right or they will let you know. So you're almost trading one department for another. You've gone out, instead of calling local businesses saying, hey, do you want to be, what would be Park Place? You're going, all right, cool. who do we put here that's not going to really make the fans angry, or what location from this part of the story are we going to jam in there? That becomes a new research department for you guys. I would imagine would have to come out of that.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting things kind of in relationship to that is any one of us are a fan of a whole series of different things, right? So when you see a game like Monopoly customized to your favorite IPs, you're like, why wouldn't they have done this for jail instead of jail? Or why is this character or this person missing? Well, what people don't understand is the whole licensing side, the business side of what we do, which is because we're a licensee of Hasbro for the use of the Monopoly game, there are parameters that we have to follow. And one of those parameters is we cannot change the four corner squares. We cannot change the color bar orientation and the pricing and the directives on the chance and chess cards. There are some, inherent structural things that we cannot mess with. As much as it might make the game that much more enjoyable to customize it to whatever fandom we're working within. We did a lot of sports games, and there were inherently past players that were obviously missing from those franchise games, but it's because the estates were unavailable,
right?
The licensing wasn't going to work out, or they just weren't allowing their names and likenesses to be used in commercial product. And of course, fans, are screaming about how let down they are because their favorite player or their favorite character is not involved in something.
Now, with that though, Tony, like in the last couple of years, we've been able to kind of mess around a little bit with like the Monopoly bar that's on top.
Yeah.
Obviously, as Hasbro has updated the brand and moved like recently now away from the Monopoly Man to now just being the red Monopoly bar. Like this year alone, I think we had 2 ones that kind of played with that. We had Garbage Pail Kids, which then was a totally custom illustrated piece, which looks fantastic. And then for Breaking Bad, for some magical reason, we were able to get that blue crystalline sort of bar on there as well, which was pretty neat.
Yeah. So as mentioned, we have these parameters and guide rails that we have to stay within for using the branding. And in the early 2000s, maybe even right around 2000, we did our first Spider-Man edition, and we started to break some rules graphically with the game that Hasbro allowed us to do, which really opened up the opportunity for some of the later exploration that both Hasbro and the Op have been able to do. And just like any company, Hasbro has gone through a number of changes internally with their team, with their brand strategies, and even the games that they're putting out themselves. And so I would like to believe, based on the work that we've done over the number of years that we've been doing this, we've only helped expand the brand awareness for Monopoly and therefore helped Hasbro get better at expanding beyond what they normally or traditionally would have done. So you're seeing things like their Game of Thrones edition that has the music in it, or this custom Deadpool box that's this whole unboxing experience that's so incredibly unique. And or allowing things like us to change these Monopoly logos, which when you talk to a designer from the graphic side of things, they want to customize everything, but there have been so many rules and regulations at different times that sometimes we're not ready to push the boundary. And there are certain games and certain IP that really sort of hearken that request to become more important to push the boundary and or make the actual request. And the 2 that Ross are mentioning are perfect examples of, a much better integration of IP into the play experience so that the fans are being nodded to and supported, even that much more uniquely.
So I feel like Risk and Monopoly for Game of Thrones also got kind of that licensed attunement too, right? Like didn't those both kind of get more Westerosi as we get to play around with those? Is Westerosi the word for it? Right.
Well, in a lot of ways, yeah. I mean, the all black sort of look to it is very different from the other editions we've done. They're a little more understated, more classic. And I think when you look at Risk in general, from a game design perspective, like Monopoly, if you're buying a licensed Monopoly, you open the box, you expect there to be the right number of property spaces, 4 railroads, the corner spaces. Like there's a fandom and an expectation around the game brand, sort of what Tony was saying of like, if we were like, what if we did 50 properties on a Monopoly? Somebody would get that home and go, what's going on here? This isn't the Monopoly I grew up with or that I remember, so they would want a different, more traditional board to it. But with Risk, we can really turn those knobs a little bit more because you're doing a custom map every time. And there's a certain number of territories and regions you need to have in that, but how they're laid out, how they connect, what the shapes of those territories and regions are, you can really customize. And Game of Thrones was one where it's like, okay, there's 2 boards in there, and there's 7 factions you can play instead of 5, and there's objectives you're completing, which we've added to a lot of the Risk games, and putting this new twist on it where you don't have to wipe everyone off the map. You just have to complete 3 major objectives to win the game. And you've got money you can spend to get influence over people and characters you can bring into it. And there's all these different elements that you kind of go like, yeah, at the core of this, I see Risk, and I want to move into your territory. We're going to roll some dice and fight. But then there's all these extra things going on that are like Risk plus, and some of that is art and design, and some of that is gameplay. And it's really fun to see how we can understand all the rules from both sides of the fandom of what do Game of Thrones fans want, but what do Risk fans want? And there is a whole community of people who have and play every Risk and create their own fan versions of Risk and come up with different maps. And we always try to be careful about like trying to find the best way to please both sides of the fandom of, somebody who maybe knows Game of Thrones a little bit but loves Risk and they're going to pick that up. And then somebody who loves Game of Thrones and maybe hasn't played Risk since they were a kid, or they've seen it played but they've never played themselves, who don't have that same level of like connection to the game system. And we've got to balance both.
Well, the funny thing is you talk about modifying the rules of Risk for Game of Thrones to where it's not just, wipe everyone off the map. I've always found that part of Risk to be taxing. It's something that has kept me from playing it so many years, but knowing that you've put this twist on it where all of a sudden, all right, I can still fight, but I can do these objectives and speed the game up. That just makes it more appealing to me at this point as both a fan of games and of course Game of Thrones. Has there been other not game engines, but game types like, really can't do it for Monopoly, but things that you put that little twist on to either speed up or change the gameplay in a non-obstructive way?
Well, one of the cool things we've done for that recently, which we could say for a classic game, has been Talisman. Talisman's been a game that historically has been around for 30 years. A lot of people kind of call it the Monopoly of the UK, right? It's a roll and move adventure game where you're doing things in order to get to the crown of command in the middle, and then slowly, once you're there, you do 1 damage to each person still around the table, so the game can go on for what could be 6-7 hours. When really it's like, okay, I've already gotten to the middle, and now it's a slog to kind of everybody out. We've done a number of Talismans recently with Kingdom Hearts and with Batman and with Star Wars, where we've been able to streamline the movement of the characters, raising up how they can raise their abilities quicker, focusing on different things. Like Batman, it's much more PvP. You're fighting each other, where Kingdom Hearts is very co-op, and then where Star Wars is you're raising up your team and getting more allies. And then also streamline the gameplay down to about 2.5 hours instead of 5 or 6. So
how many classic titles, not IPs, but what classic games have you redone? We've already established Monopoly. We've established Risk. What else is there that you guys have taken on?
So we talked about Trivial Pursuit, that we do the different versions. We talked about those last night. Clue, of course, with the Hasbro family of games. We talked about Talisman just now. We've done so many.
Jenga,
Scrabble, Yahtzee,
Life.
Life, yes.
Operation,
Candyland.
Is it Perfection?
Yes, we have the Disney Perfection.
Disney, yeah.
And I don't think we've done a Chutes and Ladders, but we've kind of talked about doing a couple with those, right? So I don't think it's happened yet. So
now it's when you get an IP, do you look at it for a specific game? Like, all right, we're going to do a Monopoly of this, or we can't do a Monopoly of that. Let's move that into the Clue. Do you have or is there? They set rules. You can only do this game with this IP. Or if you had the freedom, could you take something like Dungeons and Dragons and make a Chutes and Ladders out of it?
So, funnily enough, we're sort of, we're always in the brainstorming process, but Tony, Ross, and I have all been part of the sort of visioning and future planning experience over the years, and we'll look at it from different angles of like, okay, what are all the IPs that might fit a clue? What would the mystery be? Are there enough characters? Can we do a map? Is that IP going to let us do custom art for the board? Like, there's a lot of factors we have to look at in order to do that. And then what is the long-term vision for that particular IP? So if we're going to reach out and do a Marvel game, we don't want to just do one and then walk away. We want to have kind of a program of games around that brand, or Rick and Morty, or whatever it may be. So we start looking at like, okay, what makes sense in the first year to kind of launch our foray into this brand? Is it a monopoly? Does that brand fit, or does it fit better with a clue? Is it something we should be doing puzzles or Rubik's Cubes for? Is there a Yahtzee concept in there that makes sense? But then we're also looking at the hobby side of it too, of like, should we have an original game that we build from the ground up? Or should it be a Talisman or Munchkin or any of the other brands we work with? So we kind of take this holistic picture of where does this brand fit from an IP perspective, but also where do our game systems fit and what do they need to be successful? And there are plenty of wacky and off the wall ideas that, you know, get a lot of excitement and then don't make it through the various test points of we can't get the license, or, you know, we do our market research and the fandom isn't there to support it, or, you know, we can get the license, but they won't let us do the art we need to make the game function. So I think there's probably plenty on the cutting room floor that fans
someday the April 1st lists are going to become real. It's
yeah.
going to be
Yeah.
But what's kind of neat on that too, like you bring up Dungeons and Dragons, like so last year when we came out with Dungeons and Dragons Clue, one of the cool things we were able to do was work right alongside Wizards of the Coast and our D&D Clue, which was a remake because we had done one for 3.5 originally, which looked super cool, and now we got to do this one for 5th. But it wasn't just for 5th; it was able to come out at the same time that they were coming out with a oh my gosh, I'm blanking, but the Descendant to Avernus, right?
Yes.
Right. So the whole storyline, it hit right when that new edition came out. We're doing all these things, so it was good.
Plus, your Clue also has a little bit of macabre twist to it, much like D&D, where death is a real thing. You actually introduce death into Clue. Like, as a player, you can very much die while you're looking for the answers and be out of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always fun to find that, like, how do you bring that some aspect of story to life, right? And really stress it in a different way, or what can we do that's different but within the system, you know, whether it's like Bob's Burgers, right, which has all custom art on it that's like, this is Clue, but it's the Bob's Burgers characters illustrated into a Clue environment, not just taking style guide art or things like that. Or can we put a twist on it like we did with D&D? And to Ross's point, like a lot of times it's a preview of what's to come. So we just did Warhammer Risk, and that was like, as we were playing it, it's like, oh, by the way, the new Warhammer stuff is coming. So here's everything you need to know to kind of set this game up to fit with what's coming in the future, rather than having it come out and be, you know, oh, these are the sets that were out a year or 2 years ago. So it's always fun to kind of get those previews and think ahead, and sometimes know like, oh, we're putting this in a game because we know something the fans don't know, but this is going to pop out later and they're going to go, oh, I see why you did that piece, or put it this way, or highlighted this aspect of it. So it's always fun to find those little gems to put in.
You ever been too far ahead of the curve on something where something was going to happen within the game that you actually had to go and put a strap on, or a card set, or something that changed the game after you put it out to make it fit into the universe when, like, say, a new Marvel movie would drop and things would change in that universe? They would add a character or something like that.
Yeah, there's always challenge with that, right? And sometimes we'll do that through promo cards. So like when we did, not a classic game, but our Thanos Rising game came out for Infinity War, and we had some insight into what was going to happen in the future with Endgame and where the story was going, but we couldn't put that in the game, right? Like there was no way Marvel fans wanted us to spoil Endgame when Infinity War was coming out, or even like the next films coming before it. So we had to kind of think about how do we do things like promo cards where, you know, Thor's character changes appearance a little bit and his role shifts and changes. And then there's always the debate of like, well, do we do an expansion? Do we add something new to this to make that happen? And then there are times where people kind of like a thing comes out and it's very specific to that brand at that time, and then the brand evolves. So, you know, looking back at like our old Marvel classic games, are pre-MCU, a lot of them, and it's, you know, if a fan were to pick that up now, they're like, what is this? Like, this is comic Marvel, and they're coming at it from the MCU fandom, you know, so there's opportunities to update and change things like that. And then other times it's classic brands, you know, like our Goonies Monopoly that just came out. The Goonies isn't changing, you know, that it's been that classic film, and so there's an expectation in a pretty narrow spot we have to hit with that and stay in line with to serve those fans. And, you know, who knows if the next movie comes out, if it ever happens, like there might be a demand of like, well, now some of that stuff that's in that game doesn't feel as up to date, or you'll have folks who say like, no, you keep my classic. I want the original Goonies and not the update.
That was actually my next question, because dealing with your company for as long as you have, there have been shifts. We'll just stick in the Marvel universe for a second. There's comic Marvel and there's the MCU. Do you consider that when you're doing classic games, would you put out 2 Marvel editions, one being classic, one being modern, of say a Monopoly, or would you just consolidate and be like, all right, we're going to do one of these? Do we pick the comic, or do we pick the one that's in the pop culture right now?
Yeah, typically we look for what's hot now, like, and sometimes it's a nostalgia brand that's getting a resurgence for whatever reason. Other times it's you know, something newer that's trending up because it's a new show that's gaining momentum. And we try to serve the largest fan base, and that can be hard to do because, you know, MCU has a really broad reach. Comics have had a really broad reach for a lot more years than the MCU, but they're not always fully overlapping audiences, right? It's more of a Venn diagram where you have some folks who only know MCU, some folks who really stick to the comics, and then a good number of people who are in that middle group that do both. And so we've always got to try to figure out which audience do we serve, and some of that is licensing rights, some of it is art assets that we can get into. But looking at, you know, what's right for right now, we tend not to do 2 things at the same time. So we wouldn't put out like Marvel comic and MCU at the same time because they kind of get in each other's way. But there's other times where we sort of do a reissue. So like Ross talked about D&D Clue. It's like, well, we had the edition we did for D&D 3.5. And then as things changed and new editions came out and there were updates, it felt like it was time for that game, which had been off the market for a long time, to get a new reintroduction, as the D&D fan base has grown so much with 5th edition and with all of the new content coming, that it felt like this is the right opportunity for us to put this out there and to strike while fans are really into D&D.
So
another example along the same lines, different IP, is Ducktales. So there's this new genre of fans because of the new show, but the group here in this circle all grew up with the original Ducktales. So if we're making games for this community, it's likely the nostalgic group as opposed to the current group. But because there's a current marketing heat, we're going to ride that tail or ride that trend with something classic. So we'll do classic art and execution, but we'll tie marketing in as it relates to something current.
You actually answered the question I was going to ask on trends, and you just nailed it. It was almost like you were reading my mind. There is something interesting with classic games, though, and as we progress, there's always this question of technology and how games are pressing technology. I mean, is how much further can you go as a company that does tabletop with technology that is saddled on you now, and are you doing something to press table technology a little further?
It's an interesting question because there's a number of different ways to do that, right? There's porting an existing tabletop product into, you know, a mobile game, right? And there's a number of publishers that do that and do that fairly well. So that's one way to approach it. Another way to approach it is that there's some way to tie a piece of technology into the gaming experience, whether it be like an escape room and you've got sort of the GM or the clock acting from a digital device. And or there's technology, you know, I'm going to go back to something like rudimentary from our catalog, like Operation. the electronic game board component is sort of newer technology, right? Within the sort of tabletop experience. It's just it's an electronic feedback loop is all that is. But I think your question is more coming from how does this newer technology integrate into the sort of classic tabletop trend? I think really where we're going to see more development, I don't know if it's going to be from us, is probably in two fashions. One is VR and AR. We're seeing a lot of development in those regards. Actually, maybe three. Alexa-driven gameplay, where an Alexa or a voice-enabled app that you're playing alongside with the table experience. There's a couple of products out now that do that. And then thirdly, taking like a digital play table, if you will. There's a couple of developers out there that are developing devices now. It's like a gigantic iPad, for all intents and purposes, that you're playing a much larger version of a digital version of the game.
Sounds like you just blow up an iPhone and you're playing it on that instead.
Yeah. Some of those are trying to integrate RFID capabilities so that you can bring game pieces onto the board, so you're crossing over between physical and digital in a much richer way. For us, we're talking about classic games. I think our core strengths are sticking with cardboard, first and foremost. But I think with that, there are some exciting things that we're working on that we'll be able to talk about in the coming weeks.
Well, what's even fun about that, though, and playing to the other side of technology, is it isn't always about how you play the actual game, but how you engage with fans and other people in the community, right? Like right now with TikTok, we're seeing board games do really well on TikTok. While there isn't like a TikTok game that's being played, people are sharing cool little videos and things like our Telestrations party game is like in millions of views on TikTok because people are doing their little flips and the things and making all that fun that way. So it's one of those things where it's like, well, sure, we're seeing all these classic games getting new lifts and different technology being added to the actual gameplay. But at a certain point in time, like, it's nice just to throw the dice down, flip some cards up and do that. But now with cameras, we have these really nice photos and cameras that you can take on with your phone. So getting some really nice photos of that and being able to share it on Instagram, that's a whole other way that people get to engage with technology with these games as well.
So you have seen social media cause a lift with classic games like Clue or Risk or Telestrations for one of your own products.
Oh, completely, right? I would even say right now one of the interesting things that's happening is what is a gamer, right? What does being a modern gamer mean to you, right? And we could talk about, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, I think, like all the different kind of hobby games that are out there and things like that. But at the same time, just because you've played D&D for 20 years or you're up on the latest Kickstarter or you're back in the latest thing, it's the latest hot trend, that's great. But at the same time, like people that play Monopoly every day, they're still gamers too, and everybody that plays games and is a part of that. So like if you love, like I love playing Risk with my family at Thanksgiving, like obviously I've got a whole slew of games that I could bring to them, but we love throwing down original Risk with the numerals, right? And it's got the old school board, very sepia tone, right? And we're hardcore gamers, but still like, oh, we're throwing down Risk and we're going to fight over who's getting Australia, right? So, and that's just something to think about too. I have a question. I love how Monopoly sets sealed in cellophane. I know lots are starting to put the two little sticky circles in sealed. I'm glad the op keeps. Yeah, I'm sure we'll keep wrapping ours in cellophane. So that'll be a thing. It's definitely a design packaging choice, but that's a good question. I don't see us going to the 2-sticker route. I think we're much more of the classic wrap. It's better for our packaging. I mean, I could go nerd out on the packaging stuff for that, but I don't.
Dude, there's nothing better than cutting through that cellophane and opening up the box. It's just, it really starts the board game experience right, because you're getting your hands on it. It's not booting up. It's not, unlocking a device. You're getting that physical removal of the outer skin and you just get into it. It's just, that's one of my favorite things to do.
It's a great point though, right? Like, you talk about classic games in the modern era and the Monopoly box has changed dimensions over the years. We have some that are the square box that are more the like modern hobby game size and some that are the bigger one. But like I grew up with that real thin, real big flat box. Yeah. and the corners are smashed on it, and it's been kicked around a few times. And you open that box, and I think at one point there was like a flimsy cardboard buildup in there with like a little tray on the end for the tokens and the thin plastic thing that held the money. But I'm pretty confident if I went and got out my original Monopoly set from my childhood, it would just be a bunch of loose stuff in that box, right? And when you look at how that's evolved to like, you open your Monopoly now and you've got an organizer tray that keeps everything just right. And there's an expectation now, even with the classic games, but certainly in the hobby space, that like everything needs to be packaged well and sort of, it's not just a game that goes in the closet, especially with IP-based stuff. It's a collectible, right? Like
it's a showpiece.
Yeah, you see people with whether it's their Simpsons Monopoly or, Golden Girls Clue or whatever the IP one they picked up is, it's on display. It's not just tucked away in that games closet anymore, because people want to show off their fandom. They want to share that with others. They want it known that they're really into this particular brand. And so we have to keep that in mind as we think about how do we package the games? How do we treat everything in it, whether it's the tokens, the game board, for that sort of collectible market, for that longevity. We looked at like our Trivial Pursuits. You've got the wedge that keeps everything nice and organized in a little plastic wedge, and then you've got the deluxe set with the metal tokens. Like all of these are decisions we think about of not only the gameplay experience and the art experience, but the tactile experience of what does the weight of these pieces feel like? What is the unboxing like? What is the whole experience somebody's going to have around this product? Because it really does matter.
I will tell you, I was really, really impressed last night when we were getting into the Harry Potter Trivial Pursuit. Just the weight of each one of those tokens and the care that was put into designing the piece on it was amazing. After we got done messing around with it, I was putting it away. I spent a good 10 minutes looking at each one of the pieces and just admiring the craftsmanship of it. It's gorgeous. You guys do amazing work.
Thank you. We're pretty fortunate. We've gone through a long road to get to where we are, to be able to execute on the sculptural side of our games. Back in the day when we were doing just Monopoly tokens, those were like the only sculpted pieces. We were working with classically trained sculptors, some of which were art-based and some of which were more engineering-based. There was one guy we worked with who was trained as a dentist. And so, in sculpting bridges and teeth, that's you need fine motor skills and a high attention to detail. He got out of that business and clearly went into other stuff. But sculpting in wax, as opposed to what's being done now, which is all digital. We've gone through this whole amazing shift in the business in and of itself. And so we are very fortunate to have an in-house 3D design team that is able to bring all of this amazing, rich IP to life in such intricate detail. And then, of course, some of it gets limited by the manufacturing process, but even still, the final execution of a lot of this stuff that we're putting out now is just mind-boggling. And not just us, this whole industry, like the stuff that is coming out from a manufacturing perspective has just evolved so much. It's amazing.
What's kind of neat though, that there's really quick on that, on what Tony talked about with the traditional sculpting. If you looked at one of our first videos on our YouTube channel, it's if you scroll all the way down to our first video, it's of the sculpting of the World of Warcraft Monopoly pieces, and it has all the traditional sculpting. That video has like 1 million views, like it's crazy. But it's
that's a local San Diego guy by the name of Alec McTurk, and he was one of our primary sculptors for a really long time, and then as we started migrating into digital, we needed his services less and less.
It's kind of fun to have him come back and do some like old school sculpting for some pieces.
Well, it's certainly like in talking about how technology has impacted not just for the user experience, but for the creative experience, to be able to do everything digital and then print it 3D in our office, and then to mock up and laser cut tokens and do all that kind of stuff right on site, I think has really changed how we approach the design and creation of these games. Because there are times where it's like, okay, we print this set of Monopoly tokens and resin to check them out and see, and it's like, well, the detail doesn't really translate because it's sculpted digitally, and so they've got it blown up many times over the size the token will be. And then when you shrink it down and print it out, you kind of go, well, that detail didn't translate, or this doesn't come through, and we can kind of troubleshoot all of that in-house in a much more rapid way, which is cool. And certainly like doing like Yahtzee cups and custom sculpting those. There's a lot more opportunity to be able to do that and experiment in-house. And we've got some really talented painters on staff too that can dress all that stuff up and make it look fantastic.
So question here, turning back to IPs and classic games, is there one IP and classic game combo that you get requests for the most? What is the number one that you can beat up on?
It's Harry Potter Monopoly.
Really?
That is 100% the one we get requested for the most.
And what year was that made, Ross?
Oh, that was made in 22.
Unfortunately, that game has never been made and will likely never be made.
I almost want to ask about the stories about that, but I'm probably pretty sure that I will get. We can't talk about that right now.
The Ministry of Magic will show up and make sure that doesn't happen. So,
at the core, it just goes back to the licensing guidelines, right?
Yep.
Licensors have certain things that they're willing to allow and other things that they don't. So we're able to take the Harry Potter IP and to an amazing amount of avenues. Just Monopoly isn't one of them. And of course, we're not the only ones to ask. Hasbro has also asked and had been interested in doing the same. But of the games that we have done, Ross, which one do you think has been the most requested?
Of the games that we have been the most requested, interesting. Yeah. Well, we were talking about it last night, and I think like for one of those things, we ended up doing the Horror Trivial Pursuit Deluxe. And I don't know if that's fully like requested one, but obviously because the community was all about it, making that happen was a big thing. But if I had to think about it, oh man.
Yeah, sometimes things we do prompt. Yeah. So like when we did Warhammer Monopoly, I think the almost immediate response was, when is Risk coming?
When is Risk coming, right? Yeah.
And we see that a lot of when we release one brand, people are like, okay, but what about this other one? You know, can you do that
crashed our website so bad. It was great.
But they were demanding it so hard that it crashed your site. That's
well, when we finally announced it, because we did announce Warhammer 40K Risk in February, and it was just everyone was like, "What?" It was awesome.
But I would have to say from a most requested and or probably one of the more popular ones was probably the original Simpsons Monopoly game.
Oh yeah, 100%. There we go.
And we printed that one twice. Hasbro reverse licensed it, brought it into the mass market. They did it twice. Then it was off the market for a while, and then we've re-released it. So there have been 5, I think, versions of it. We even did a Treehouse of Horror edition at one point, but that world is just so rich. And to know that there were 5 editions of that game is, I think, speaks volumes to the passionate fan base that's there.
Oh, yeah.
So is there one, and I'll ask this to each of you individually, is there one classic game IP combo that you would want if you could just, and now I'm going to take Harry Potter off the table because we already know that one's there. We already know that everybody wants that one. If you could put your dream together, which one would it be, Ross?
I'm going to get in trouble for just sharing things here, but I gotta be careful on this one, right? I want Mean Girls Risk. I'm just going to say it.
Hey, dude, you can want all you can want what you want all you want, my friend.
I want it all day.
You can want it all day. And you know what? That is the game I would play with you. Pat, what's yours?
This is tough because like there's a couple that I would put on my list that I think might end up happening soon. So I don't want to spoil that and get in trouble.
That's what I was trying to like gauge. I was like,
yeah, because getting to push for the ones I want helps because I can sit in the meeting and go, you know what we should do. Can I say one that I wanted that we weren't able to get? Is that fair?
I don't know, Pat, use your gut feeling here.
It's such a loaded question. You can pass if
know what? I'll throw it out there. I wanted to do a LaCroix version of Monopoly. I wanted like translucent little fruit tokens and as the pieces and the different flavors around the board. I thought that would be fun. Because I like the sleepers, like the things that people didn't know they wanted until it comes out, like Hallmark Channel.
Hallmark, that was crazy last year.
Yeah.
Man, Hallmark Monopoly, Jeremy, was just like a huge hit. Golden Girls Clue has been a huge hit.
Yep.
Right? Like things like that. We're just like, what? Awesome. Let's do more of that.
All right, Tony, you've had the most time to think about it.
So I would have to say that we actually got to make one of mine, which was the original Spider-Man game. That was just so much fun to work on and get to work with that classic art and to break some graphic boundaries.
It's like the 90s art?
Yeah, it was a bunch of Jim Lee art.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was just like, the black divider lines was the webbing that he would throw. I mean, it was just like so much fun.
Great.
So that was a pretty exciting one. But for years and years, we have asked to be able to be doing really sort of collector end specialized editions of Star Wars Monopoly games. And because Hasbro is the master toy licensee for that IP here in North America, and there's only so much throughput that Lucas can handle, and there's only a certain number of games that Hasbro wants to put out with that IP, it's not one that they're going to allow us to really play with, because they already have enough plans and they have enough ability to maximize that license in a way that makes sense. That said, over the years, we've had a number of great ideas and executions that would have been way more in line with like the audience that we feed, like the deep fans, more like classic storyline edition or a particular character edition. So that's definitely one that I think would have been really amazing to have gotten the opportunity to do.
Well, I will tell you mine. It's Big Lebowski Clue.
That would be
good.
White Russians not included.
That would be one of the murder weapons.
Yes, it
would
would be.
it be a murder, or would it be trying to find out about his rug man? Because I could really brought the room together.
That's what I thought, but it's always the same thing. It's always who on the rug, but and what rug and who did it.
Why is there this toe over here? I don't get what this is for.
Exactly.
Right?
Another murder weapon.
A bowling ball be a murder weapon, right?
See, I put some thought into this. I actually had that in my head before I asked the question.
You were prepared. Well, one of the things that Pat said is, we're part of this group of people that weekly meets to go to throw a bunch of wet noodles at the wall on IP and game brands to see what the best mashups are going to be. So our lists over the years have been quite exhaustive. And, if we were to go back through and call through a bunch of those, there'd probably be a small handful of those that would have been wonderful to come to light. But, there have been so many other ideas that have come and gone since some of those other great ideas. It's really kind of hard to think of them all. And also the other part of your question, which was, were there some games that were going to be huge hits and then just didn't end up working very well? There definitely were a couple of those. And some of it, I think, has to do with the fan base, right? And or even the retail landscape. So the fan base, there may be millions of people who are watching a particular show, and that's the way they engage with that IP. They want nothing to do with T-shirts, mugs, games, anything. It's just that they're fans of that show. So that said, since there's millions of fans of certain IP, we've tried a number of different times throughout the years to create product to cater to these fan groups, and some unexpectedly take off, and others just they do our sort of minimum run, and it's just like, wow, that was underwhelming, And some that even make really great sense on paper, like Sesame Street. We did an amazingly beautiful Sesame Street Monopoly game, and the tokens were beautiful, the art was great. It just did not perform at retail, which is unbelievable, because that IP has a demographic reach beyond just the sort of here and now group. So you win some, you lose some.
Thank you for remembering that I asked that question, by the way. That was literally all the way at the beginning of our conversation. You circled it around for me, but as we're closing in on this segment for our hour, we'll just go around the table, and we'll start with you, Tony, in terms of classic games for a modern gamer. Any last thoughts, anything that we missed that you wanted to talk about, anything that you want to end on?
I think one of the interesting things about this conversation about classic games is each of us watching this right now and or here on the panel can probably remember back to one of the very first games that we played that was not the traditional game that every household had, right? And I think it's really exciting to get to be a part of a group and a company and an industry that is really bringing a lot of passion to resurrecting a lot of those games and or allowing those games to continue on through history. There's a great company called Restoration Games that sort of reimagines older classic games. And a lot of what we do is very similar. We take these classic game brands and we bring them into this sort of new realm and this new possibility of passion. And there's a handful of games that are classic that I would love to be able to do that with, but I don't know if that'll ever happen. That said, there are still some classic games that I grew up playing that I still play to this day, and one of those is Can't Stop. And I'll end there.
Thank you. Pat, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'll kind of add on to what Tony was saying, the idea that, like, being involved in a lot of the communities for hobby games and things like that, people sort of talk about their journey through, and they usually talk about that, like, oh, what was your first real game, right? Like your first hobby game, because it's sort of just accepted. Everyone played Monopoly or Clue or Risk or some combination of those games, and Yahtzee as a kid or, growing up, or even still as an adult. And it's like, okay, when did you go past the thing that, quote, everyone knows? And sometimes there's this desire to, like, okay, you can't go backwards and play those. And to me, it's not really about that. Like, as Tony said, there's still some classic games, and Ross mentioned this too, that get played often. And I know, like, every holiday, if I'm back at my parents' house, we will play Scrabble more than once, and then we'll break out Super Scrabble and we'll play the big board. And then, we'll see if we all remember all of the playable 2-letter and 3-letter words, which, if you're going to compete in that household, you better. And we find our fun with it because it's tradition, right? And I can remember back to, like, playing Monopoly with all my cousins growing up, and that was like summer vacation. It's raining out. Okay, we're all going to play Monopoly. And being one of the younger cousins in that group, I went to the library and got the strategy book and read How to Win Monopoly. And then I went back the next summer and, basically tried to crush everybody. And exactly, yeah. And it's no surprise probably that I ended up in game design, but, like, there's memories and positivity associated with all that. So when I came to work at the Op, it was like one of the first games I did was Rick and Morty Risk, and it was like, felt like kind of being given this rite of passage that, like, this brand that is just synonymous with board gaming, and being able to take that and monkey with it a little bit, but also honor the tradition of it. And I think that's what these games are all about. And I always encourage people, no matter how far you are down along your gaming journey, sometimes it's fun to just pick up a classic, especially one for an IP you love, and revisit it, or introduce it to new people, or introduce it to a group of kids who haven't played it before, and remember kind of what that was like to start out.
That's awesome. I still want to actually go get Game of Thrones Risk now and replay Risk, because you've made me want to do that. Thanks, Pat. Ross, your final thoughts.
My main thing is, I kind of touched on it a little bit in the panel earlier, but it's anybody that plays games, you're a gamer, right? Like if you play Monopoly, if you play Scrabble, if you play Risk, there's a lot of words going around about how certain games are gateway games or foundation games, and like how there's some larger journey for you to go on. But at the end of the day, like, the games that you play, that's the games that you want to do. So if you're really into, I love playing Monopoly and Risk with the family and doing things like that. But at the same time, like, I am ready to throw down for Twilight Imperium, right? So those are two different spectrums for games, But at the same time, if we're hanging out, having a good time, creating those moments on the table, rolling dice, playing cards, that's what it's all about, And then but at the same time, like with USA Monopoly, we're going to keep putting really cool brands mashed up with really cool licenses. It's super fun. We love doing it. We have a lot of fans at the company that really enjoy making that happen. This next year, we have a lot of cool stuff lined up, and it's just going to be a good time, So if you want to do things from Monopoly, Clue, Yahtzee, Risk, Jenga, Trivial Pursuit, go on our site, check them out. We've got a lot of cool things going on. Test your fandom, play your games, So that'll be good.
Ross, Pat, Tony, thank you guys very much for your time. It has been a blast. I can't believe an hour has shot by already.
That was so quick.
Thank you for your knowledge, your passion, everything you do. It was a pleasure getting to talk with you guys.
Nice hanging out with you, Jeremy.
We will see you in a few hours, 5 o'clock, our last game of day 2
It's gonna be-
on 2020. We're getting into blank slate. I cannot wait. We'll see you there.